the really hated Montreal Canadiens. Yes, as a Leaf fan, and yes, a guy from Southern Ontario, I cannot stand the Habs for ruining the Leafs' chances year after year after fucking year. Anyway, the Canadiens are one of the originals of the NHL. They were part of the first ever season in 1917-18, alongside Toronto and Ottawa, among others, and the Montreal Wanderers. But of course, the Montreal Wanderers arena burnt down, so the Habs had Montreal out to themselves for many years. Montreal's won 24 Stanley Cups. In 1924, they won their second ever Stanley Cup. That being a season when Georges Vezina was decent, Howie Morenz was skating circles around everyone, and Oriole Juliette actually came into prominence in La Belle Provence. So anyway, Montreal didn't have any competition in their city until 1924 when the Montreal Maroons were created alongside the Boston Bruins. And the form was once used for the Montreal Maroons. They wanted the Maroons to be in the form because they wanted the Maroons were the English were for English Montreal and the Canadiens were for French Montreal. But a lot of people forget that Montreal almost ceased to be in 1921, or was it 1931? I can't remember. I think it was 31. There was a lot of problems with financing. Cleveland nearly became the city where Montreal was, truth be told. I'm just amazed. However, Montreal was saved by a few owners, one of them from Illinois by the name of Leo Durand. But they kept the team in Montreal, and Montreal was happy. It's another team. 1931 was when they won their second straight Stanley Cup, and the fans were happy to see the Habs win the Stanley Cup. However, it took 13 years to get back to the Stanley Cup Finals and become a powerhouse. That's what fans called the Dark Ages, the late 30s, early 40s in Montreal. 1944, they ended up winning the Stanley Cup, mostly due to some great prowess on the part of Maurice Rocket Richard, who was still a youngling, if you will. Montreal gelled. In the 1940s, they won 3 Stanley Cups. They even discovered a raw talent by the name of Bill Durnan, who was a decent goaltender, who was ambidextrous, who could have the glove on either side of his body and all that. And he was a captain, too. Bill Durnan lasted a while, but then he decided to retire in 1950. Before being, he would have been victimized in the 1951 Stanley Cup final against the Leafs. Who knows? Maybe he would have helped the Habs win the Stanley Cup, but he decided to quit at the height of his power. Not the first Montreal goalie to do that. Montreal was a powerhouse in the 1950s, especially the late 50s. The year after Rocket Richard got his famous expulsion from Clarence Campbell, who basically thought he was doing a hockey move, but French Canada thought he was doing it because he was a frickin' Anglophone. And being English, they had a much hatred thing. The problem with that is that then fine institutions that had their city locations in Montreal, like Sun Life and the Bank of Montreal, would move to Toronto. But that was not just because of the Quiet Revolution, it was because of something else. But anyway, Montreal, from 56 to 60, were a powerhouse. 5 straight Stanley Cups. You can imagine that. Of course, it's a little bit biased because they had to play only 2 playoff rounds, whereas you have to play 4 playoff rounds nowadays. But Montreal still had some great players. They had 12 players with getting the 5 straight Stanley Cups. Even a guy by the name of Dolard St. Laurent. Well, you had Tom Johnson, Doug Harvey, Henri and Rocket Richard, Chuck Plant, Jean Beliveau, Dickie Moore, Toe Blake, I think. No, wait, Toe Blake was the coach. I would say Phil Goyette, but I'm probably wrong. Yeah, there's a lot of them. So anyway, Montreal won 5 straight Stanley Cups, and then 61 was shocked by the Blackhawks in the semifinals. Montreal wouldn't go quietly. In 1965, they were forced to the brink by the Chicago Blackhawks to Game 7. But Sean Beliveau, 14 seconds into Game 1, into that first period of Game 7, scored the goal, and Montreal did not relent. 3 straight goals made it 4-0, and the Habitants gagne. So anyway, Montreal tried. They won again in 1966, but Henri Richard's goal was often deemed controversial because they don't know how the puck got into the net. Montreal was looking for a three-peat in 67. Heck, Mayor Jean Drapeau said that with Expo 67 happening, the cup will feel right at home in the Quebec Pavilion. How wrong he was, and despite Punch and Black insulting Montreal goalie Rogie Vachon, saying he was a junior B goalie, Rogie Vachon was decent for the Montreal Canadiens. Gump Worsley was nowhere to be seen, if you will, in that series. Charlie Hodge also tried. But the 67 Habs learned the hard way. You don't mess with Leafs power. And the Leafs ended up winning the Stanley Cup, putting Montreal in trouble. And, ironically enough, Montreal and Toronto now have the same amount of Stanley Cups, 13 each. After that, it was an 11-11 tie. So after that, you got yourself 1968. The Habs got revenge. They won the Stanley Cup, not only in 68, but in 69. And thanks to a weird divisional matchup, they had to face the great expansion team, and that would be St. Louis. Now, St. Louis was no slouch. They had some former Habs, Dickie Moore, Doug Harvey, and Jacques Plante, among others. And the Blues were tight. I mean, yeah, the Blues lost all 4 games in 1968, but the Habs only beat them by 1 goal each time. I mean, the effort matters. Montreal in 1970 would slip up, even though they were back-to-back Stanley Cup champs. They lost on the final day of the year a chance to get in the playoffs. Now, stupidly, the NHL decided to make getting the playoffs if there was a tiebreaker by goal scoring and not by head-to-head records or by wins. And that screwed Montreal up, as the Rangers snuck in on the final day of the 1970 season to take the 4th spot in the Eastern Division. That was the last time Montreal missed the playoffs for 25 years, mind you. But in 1971, the Habs looked good, kind of good. They took 3rd in the East, but strangely enough, because of the weird format being 1 versus 3, 2 versus 4, Montreal would have faced New York in, if it was 2 versus 3, but it was 1 versus 3. So they played Boston, who scored 399 goals in that 71 season. They were huge, and they were the defending Stanley Cup champions. Montreal had a secret weapon, 6'4" Cornell-educated Ken Dryden, who did have a few terrible games against Boston. However, Montreal's resiliency was established in Game 2 when down 5-1. They didn't panic. They scored 6 straight goals to win Game 2 and put Boston in the back burner. Montreal ended up winning Game 7 in Boston, which was amazing. They took care of the Minnesota North Stars before having a scare against the Chicago Blackhawks, especially in Game 7 of the final. Down 2-0, Jacques Laperriere's Lemaire. I think it was Lemaire, not Laperriere. But anyway, he scored a goal from center ice over Tony Esposito's shoulder to make it 2-1, and then Henri Richard put up 2 goals. Of course, the 71 team would be marred because of Al McNeil's pure hatred for Pocket Rocket, and ended up sending French Canada, who basically wanted his head on a platter. Thankfully, though, Scotty Bowman was just fired by the Blues, so he got to be in Montreal. Scotty Bowman led Montreal to many cups in the 1970s. One of the best cups of all time was 1976, when they took care of the 2-time defending champion Philadelphia Flyers with their speed and finesse instead of grit and brawling and all that. That changed hockey forever. No more will there be like tons of fights on the ice. All that. You need grinders. You need a team of grinders. You basically needed some skill on your team. And, funny enough, the next year was one of the greatest years of all time. Montreal, in 80 games, won 60 of them. 8 losses, 12 ties. Unfortunately, though, it's a little bit biased because Montreal could have had more wins because they took overtime out in 1943 for the war and did not put it in until 1984, 4 decades after it happened. I mean, yeah, for like 10 years, but now regulation games ended in ties all the time. Who knows what type of heights Montreal would have faced if they didn't have to deal with those 12 ties. Probably like 6 or 7 more wins. That's the problem. But yeah, they easily took care of the Boston Bruins. They swept them in the Stanley Cup Finals. Jacques Lemaire scored the winning goal in overtime. Montreal won 78-79. Of course, 79 they have to thank Stan Jonathan of the Bruins because of his too many men on the ice call that got Guy Lafleur the tying goal in the power play, and in Game 7 of the semifinals against Boston, and then a Goal by Yvonne Lambert over Gilles Gilbert's shoulder in overtime. Montreal almost lost its dynasty when in 1970, in the 79 Stanley Cup Finals, Ken Dryden was yanked in Game 1 for Buddy LaRocque. Such prudence. Buddy LaRocque was due to start Game 2 of the Rangers series against the Rangers. However, thankfully, Ken Dryden can thank Doug Rusville, Kitchener Ranger, by the way, for putting a warm-up shot accidentally hurting Buddy LaRocque up high in his body and put Dryden back in the net. Dryden played his heart out and did not have any fucking problems. Montreal missed a chance to go for 5 in a row like their brethren from the late 50s in 1980 when they lost Game 7 of the semifinals to the quarterfinals to the Minnesota North Stars. Minnesota would be taken care of by the Philadelphia Flyers. Who knows? Maybe the Habs might have taken care of the Flyers. Who knows? That could have been a great what if. But I'm not one to say that. And besides, they lost Lemaire, they lost Bowman, and they lost Ken Dryden. I don't think they were that good. I know in 1981 they were number 3 in the NHL and wanted to put Gretzky in their back pockets, but unfortunately they got swept. Montreal had a few rising goal rookies coming in at the right time, like Steve Penny in 1984, before the Islanders beat them in the conference final. When 1986 took the cake, Patrick Roy wasn't expected to do much. He was supposed to fight with Doug Soultart for the number 1 spot. He took the number 1 spot in the playoffs. The rookie did his job. He took care of Boston. He took care of Hartford. He took care of the Rangers, and he took care of Calgary to get the Stanley Cup. Of course, Patrick was my idol. It's a little bit biased, but I mean, Hartford put Montreal to a Game 7. Thankfully, another rookie by the name of Claude Lemieux scored the winning goal in overtime. And Watt's Game 3 efforts against the Rangers in the conference finals, stuff of legends, especially in overtime. And guess who scored the winning goal? Yes, Claude Lemieux. Say what you will about Claude Lemieux, but in playoff time, he was great. Montreal, unfortunately, would suffer the indignity of losing the Stanley Cup on their ice in 1989 to the Calgary Flames. The Flames were the only team in NHL history to win a cup against the Habs on form ice. Montreal would slide a little bit. In 93, they had a weird playoff run. They ended up third in the division, had to face the Quebec Nordiques at home ice against them. Scott Young scored an overtime goal in Game 1. And the Nordiques subsequently went up 2-0. It was rumored that Patrick Roy was going to be taken out for Andre Rasico, but Demers says he was going to go with Roy come hell or high water. And so he did. And Roy repaid his coach's patience by basically playing great, especially in overtime. Montreal did well in overtime. They actually won 10 straight overtime games within that year, not just overall, but within that year, which is weird enough. So anyway, man, that overtime, all the overtime sessions, especially, knocking the Sabres off. Three of the four Montreal wins over Buffalo ended up being in overtime, where my boy Gilbert Dion, former Kitchener Ranger, scored one overtime goal. The Habs took care of the Islanders twice in overtime, and then they used their first 3 wins of the finals against the Kings dans la prolongation. So yeah, including John LeClair's back-to-back overtime goal sessions. Never mind, a lot of people said that Montreal didn't deserve it because they cheated. And they waited till the right time to get McSorley off the ice for a 2-minute penalty for an illegal stick. Say what you want. That's how things are. Unfortunately for Montreal fans, that's the last time they, and Canada for that matter, have won the Stanley Cup. 94, Patrick Roy suffered a massive appendicitis. And somehow in Game 5, he played a fantastic game. Montreal beat Boston, but sadly, though, they lost Game 6 and 7 to be knocked out of the playoffs. 95, they didn't make the playoffs. And then Mario Tremblay and Patrick Roy's explosive arguments led to trouble. Tremblay leaving Patrick Roy in way too long against the Red Wings that night at the Forum. It was just amazing. Waugh was subsequently sent to Colorado for Jocelyn Thibault. Habs did make the playoffs in '96, but the Rangers came storming back from a 2-0 deficit to sink the Habitants, while Patrick Waugh got a Stanley Cup. '97, they almost got swept by the Devils, but thanks to Patrice Brisebois' triple overtime goal in Game 4, they didn't get swept, but the Devils won Game 5. Martin Brodeur added salt to the wound by scoring in overtime. So anyway, 1998 they made the playoffs. I don't know who, and Buffalo got them in the second round. They swept Montreal. And then Montreal had some lean years. They were bought by an American, but thankfully he decided to keep the team in Montreal. Obviously, he would have had to. I think I did mention that Montreal was nearly sent to Cleveland. But anyway, we'll talk about the what if for the Habs. But 2010 was an amazing year. 2004 and 2010 were great years, and Montreal were like the 8th seeds, and they pulled rabbits out of the hat. 2004, they came back from 3-1 down to sink the Bruins before the Lightning swept them. No, I think they were number 7 because Tampa was number 1 in the East that year. Oh, yeah, that's right. And then all of a sudden, 2010, they were the 8th seed against number 1 Washington, but Jaro Halak put on magic act. Chris Huet was no help. So Halak helped Montreal come back from 3-1 down and sink the Washington Capitals. Montreal even got to the conference finals, but sadly, though, Philly took them out. Yeah, Montreal hasn't done much recently. But anyway, let's talk about the 2002 Montreal Canadiens. Now you'd be thinking, hang on a minute. Why them? Well, simple. They did get the 8th seed on the last week of the year. And would have to take on the number 1 seed Boston Bruins. And they did beat Boston in 6 games in an emotionally charged conference quarterfinals, which included Saku Koivu's fantastic performance in the first Montreal home game, playoff game in 4 years. Well, that being Game 3. And then Jose Theodore's unbelievable stick save in Game 6 to sink the Bruins. And yeah, of course, Montreal had a chance to knock down Carolina and go to the conference finals, where they knew that Ottawa and Toronto were facing each other in the other semifinals. So thus, we would have an all-Canadian conference final, and we would have a Canadian team in the Stanley Cup final for the first time in 8 years, if that happened. But things were bad. Things were bad enough with Saku Koivu having to deal with chemotherapy for a type of cancer. Well, that Saku willed himself to do well for the team, and it worked. Saku actually led the Montreal Canadiens, came back to the Montreal lineup on April 9, 2002. Ironically, that's my 17th birthday, against the Ottawa Senators. Montreal's win meant they were going to the playoffs. And of course, Saku Koivu's great Game 3 and all of that. Now, Montreal had a 2-1 series lead on the Carolina Hurricanes and an irreproachable 3-0 lead in Game 4, which meant if they had hung on, they would be up 3-1 and a great chance to knock Carolina out of the playoffs. But Kerry Fraser made a dumbass move with 2 dumb penalties against Montreal. Montreal never recovered, and the Molson miracle happened. Carolina scoring a minute left in regulation to tie the game, and then Nick Wallin in overtime to sink Montreal. Series tied at 2. Carolina went on to win games 5 and 6, and Montreal's frustration was illustrated by Doug Gilmour slamming the penalty box door so hard the glass shattered. It was a scene to behold. It would have been nice to see Montreal-Toronto or even Montreal-Ottawa in the 2002 NHL semifinals to decide who could be facing the Red Wings in the Stanley Cup. So, of course, that's the what if. The 2002 Canadiens. Now, the Canadiens somehow beat the Carolina Hurricanes, and now they take on their rivals, the Toronto Maple Leafs, in the 2002 Stanley Cup semifinals. So, who will face Detroit? Of course, as usual, if I deal with one conference, I leave the other conference alone. So, Detroit will deal with it. However, if Montreal does fall to Toronto in the Stanley Cup semifinals, then Detroit automatically gets the Stanley Cup because, this is Montreal's what if. I know that it would screw Toronto over, but rules are rules, and I have to obey the rules at all times. Well, here we go. It's the 2002 Habs and the 2002 Leafs in the Stanley Cup semifinals, where will face Detroit. Both goalies, both teams using way multiple goalies. Jose Theodore, number one, Jeff Hackett, Matthew Guerin, Stefan Fiset, I forgot he played for the 2002 Habs, and Ole Michaud. The 2002 Leafs had Cujo, Tom Barrasso, Corey Schwab, and Sebastian Santomo. I wonder what happened to Barrasso, why he wasn't the backup. Or was he the backup to Cujo in the playoffs? Thinking Corey Schwab, but anyway. So anyway, playoff time. And good news for Leaf fans. They win 3-1. Goals by Green and Sundin with 2. Oleg Petrov, remember him? He scored a goal in the first minute. Sundin, Robert Theodore. So for Toronto, you'll deal with Roberts, Caberlet, McCabe, Cross, Yuskevich, Berg, Lume, Mogilny, Sundin, Corson, Renberg, Tucker, Green, Hoagland, Domi, Reichel, Falk. Of course, you do ignore the fact that Corson quit on his team. Montreal had Griswold, Perreault, Sednik, Rive, Rovidas, Dykhouse, Markov, Savage, Koivu, Gilmore, Petrov, Van Allen, Bullis, Dacko, and Juno. So 2-1, Sundin, Roberts, Theodore, the 3 stars of the game. Game number 2. Sees the Leafs doing the same thing, 4-1. Petrov scored again. And then the Leafs put up 4 goals in the third period. Renberg, Reichel, Tucker, Hoagland. Wow. Geez, Montreal had the lead again, and they fouled it up. Renberg, Tucker, Petrov, the 3 stars of the game. Well, it's time to switch her up. Cujo versus Theodore. Well, this time Montreal gets back at them. Brisebois, Savage, Brisebois. Patrice Brisebois, 2 goals. People forget he played for the 93 Habs, much less the team. Second Koivu got a double minor, but it was too little too late. The Leafs couldn't stop Theodore at all. Theodore, Brisebois, and Savage scored. So at 2-1, the Leafs are a little nervous. But the Leafs pull one back in prolongation. Darcy Tucker scored to make it 1-0. Then Matt Sundin on the power play. Doug Gilmour made it 2-1, scoring against his former team. Corey Bouvet power goals 3-2. It's like, oh my God, the Habs are going to win. But Matt Sundin at 9:45 scored that. And then Yuskevich at 2 minutes with overtime from Cross and Reichel. So Yuskevich. Remember him, Leaf fans? So Sundin, Rive, Gilmour are the 3 stars of the game. Leafs are 1 win away from knocking Montreal out of this scenario. And they did it in fine fashion, 8-3. Sorry, Montreal. It just wasn't meant to be. Hoagland and Renberg made it 2-0 Leafs. Perreault made it 2-1 for the Habs. Then Sednik made it 2-2, but Reichel made it 3-2, and then things just fell apart from there. Sundin on a power play, thanks to Perreault's penalty. Sundin scored another goal from Caberlet McGilly to chase Theodore. Then goals by Domi, Sundin, and Tucker made it 8-2 before Sednik scored to make it 8-3. Amazing. The Leafs would have done so well. I think they would have lost to the Red Wings, but at least they made it. Ole Michaud didn't do that good. So Sundin, Sednik, Renberg, the 3 stars. Sorry, Montreal, but Toronto forever. And that's the way, I like it.